Hey, my name is Dr. Sean Price, Clinical Coordinator here at The Fix in Fort Walton Beach. So again, we are now waist deep in our metabolic series. So if you haven't seen the videos leading up to this, please go back and watch them starting at video 1, because what I'm about to say may be totally confusing if you haven't watched those other videos. So keep in mind that at The Fix, we take a 3-pronged approach to healing. First of all, we look at the metabolic prong. Then we look at the neurological, and we look at the structural aspect. So we are diving in very in depth into the metabolic aspect with this video series. So this is one part of what we do in our office for treating the whole system. So again, we're in the metabolic aspect. We've talked about the thyroid metabolic pathway, blood sugar, adrenal glands, hormones. We've talked about all these things. Now we want to talk about sympathetic dominance. So again, just to recap, you have your central nervous system, which is basically your brain and your spinal cord. That has 2 main functions. One is the voluntary function, and that's basically, I take this marker, I consciously think about taking it and writing, so I consciously control those functions. That's the voluntary system. Then we have the autonomic nervous system, which is our involuntary system, or it's like our respiration, our heart rate, our digestion, all these things that we don't think about, okay? Autonomic nervous system is split into the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our feed and breathe, and the sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight. And these guys counterbalance each other. So if we have sympathetic nervous system increased, we're going to have decreased parasympathetic nervous function. That's why we're always told not to eat when we're stressed, because if you're stressed out and your sympathetic nervous system is firing, your parasympathetic nervous system won't be firing appropriately, so you won't be making enough hydrochloric acid, your gut won't be moving food well enough, and it's not going to digest appropriately. So chronic sympathetic firing does lead to decreased parasympathetic function, which leads to digestive issues, which leads to decreased thyroid metabolism. You'll know what that means if you go watch the rest of the videos. It also leads to sexual dysfunction, so on and so forth. So sympathetic dominance is very prevalent in our society. All of the patients that have hormone imbalances, we find sympathetic dominance with them. All of the patients that are having blood sugar issues, stress-related disorders, we find sympathetic dominance with them. Patients with depression, so on and so forth, we find this with them. And basically what happens is your body has what's called, this is a neuron, okay? So the neuron runs here, and then you have dendrites on the end of this neuron that go to other neurons. So when this neuron is at rest, you have sodium sitting outside the cell, potassium sitting inside the cell. Now an impulse comes in. The impulse stimulates this neuron, so potassium is pumped out and sodium is pumped in, and the resting membrane potential starts to rise. So if that impulse is strong enough to hit this firing threshold, this neuron will fire. And then that will go on to these other neurons, and the same thing happens with those guys, and that's how we get neuronal firing. Now this happens so fast that it's unfathomable, but this is the way it happens. After this neuron fires, adenotriphosphate, which is the energy currency of the body, which is the result of all metabolic pathways, adenotriphosphate comes in and puts the potassium back in the cell and pumps the sodium back out, and our body goes back down to this resting membrane potential. Now, if you have a metabolic disorder, blood sugar, thyroid, adrenal, some of these disorders that we've talked about, if anything is going on that is causing a decrease in metabolic output, which is causing a decrease in adenotriphosphate, then what happens is this neuron, instead of getting back to this resting membrane potential, may only get to here, because the body doesn't have enough fuel to completely reverse these electrolytes. So if the resting membrane potential is now there, and an impulse comes in that typically would only stimulate the nerve to right here so it wouldn't fire, but now since it's right here, that small stimulation causes this neuron to fire. You become hyper responsive. Small stimulants, small stimuli, small activities will cause a neuron to start firing. So that means that if there's a sudden loud noise, or somebody startles you, or a quick movement out of the corner of your eye, or you're emotionally hyper volatile to things that happen, anything that stimulates your system that normally would not cause a sympathetic response is now causing a sympathetic response. That's because you have metabolically created this sympathetic dominance. So one of the things that I talked about in the last video was how do you, if you live a stressful lifestyle, I live a very stressful lifestyle, for example, my wife and I run 3 businesses together. We have 4 kids. We do a lot. We are very busy. But we can handle it because what happens is we have good metabolic status, so we don't have this hyper firing. Stressors in the body only become stressors when your body responds to it, when your body has that sympathetic response. So if you've got a stressor, but you can calm down this neurological firing and calm down your immune system or your nervous system's response to it, then you calm down stress automatically, which decreases adrenal function, which puts you back into balance, which helps things happen. So metabolically, when we come in and we start working with all of these things and balancing out your system and increasing your adenotriphosphate, which allows your neuron to get back into its resting membrane potential, your body gets into ability to handle stress that it couldn't handle before. So we see that constantly with our patients. That's one of the first things that patients notice when they start our program and they start healing and start feeling better is they notice, number one, they're sleeping better, they have more energy, weight's starting to come off, and they notice that they'll go through something and they'll be like, wait a minute, I just went through that stressor and I didn't freak out. I didn't have this response that I used to have. I didn't lose my mind and over respond to this situation. And it's because their nervous system is getting into balance. So part of the goal of all this is to get out of sympathetic dominance and get into parasympathetic and sympathetic balance so that the body can function properly and your body heals. Okay, so that's the parasympathetic response. All right, in the next video, we're going to talk about the labs that we need to run, and then we're going to talk about supplementation. Okay, see you on the next.